Over the past few months, I've been reviewing a lot of your guys' games that you sent to me asking for feedback, and I recently even made a whole video where I went more in depth into some of your guys' projects. And I've been learning a lot. We've also released our own game, got a lot of feedback on that release. So I feel like at this point, I do have a little bit of credibility in knowing what I'm talking about when I'm looking at common mistakes that you guys make. Or not really mistakes, but ways that you can improve your game. Usually your games are mechanically, they're unique and they have a solid component to it. But there's a lot of things that can often be improved and that I often always have to send over and over again to you guys as feedback. So I figured in this video, I would talk about 3 main topics that I often see that you can improve upon that just elevates your game that little bit and make it go from like a 5 or a 6 out of 10 and make it like a 7 or maybe even an 8, depending on how deeply you do this. There's 3 main topics and I have a bunch of like smaller ones as well. And if you stick around, I also have a bonus one at the end of the video. Also, if you don't know yet, we have a Discord server in which if you have any other questions or advice, or you think that my ideas are dumb and you want to hear some other developers as well, you can join that one and there you can ask for advice in that Discord or just show off what you're working on as well. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about as something that you can improve and something that I have personally learned so much from since releasing our own game Forge Industry is UI. I've truly come to accept how important UI is, and you guys have pretty much held me accountable for that one. If you don't know what our game is, it's a resource automation game, and basically you play 80% of the game through the UI. So it's really important that your UI is solid, and ours wasn't really that great on launch. And I even made statements such as you don't play a game for the UI. You guys clearly disagree with that one, and I by now have noticed that as well, so please stop writing it to me in the comments of that video in which I say it. But UI is really important in making sure your game is playable and enjoyable, because you'll often be interacting with it a lot. It also depends a bit on the genre, but especially in strategy games, UI is paramount. If you have something more simple, like a shooter game, UI can also still help. I think there are some very big differences between a good UI and bad UI as well. But a UI is something that you come into contact with so often that you can really easily tell if a game has good UI or bad UI. Now, how do you make sure that your UI is good? Well, there's a few ways actually. There's probably more, but these are like my key takeaways that I usually have. And the first one is pretty much just intuitiveness. If you're a graphics designer or a UX designer, or you've ever made like a website, for example, or you've even just been on a website, you'll know that there are these conventions. There's no like hard set rules, for example, where you put menus or where you put the close button, but there's just this trend basically. Usually your close button for Windows is in the top left or the top right corner. So don't suddenly put your button in like the middle to the left or something aligned where it's not intuitive, where it's not clear where something like that would be. People often scan the top or the sides of your windows to see if there are menus or quick bars, and then use like the right main area for like your inventory or for large blocks of text, things like that. You'll quickly realize if there's something wrong with your UI if you let your game playtest and you sit next to the person and just look at what they're doing. If they have no clue what they're supposed to click on, it's not intuitive. You as a developer, because you play a game so often and you just like have to try it out, you can basically play your game blindfolded. Hell, for the longest time I played Forge Industry completely in Japanese, even though I don't really fully understand what like on all the characters meant. I just knew what I had to click and where I had to click. If you reach that point, you can't in good consciousness say anymore that your UI is solid, because you're just so used to it. So you really need to get that external feedback and really look at how do other people interact with your game. A next big thing that I see related to UI is readability. Once again, this is something that we've made the same mistake as well, such as, for example, having a light brown on a dark brown, or maybe having a red text on a brown background. Horrible to read. Similar thing with fonts. You can have like a very nice aesthetic fonts with like a lot of curls and such, but they're just not readable. Always make sure that your text is as readable as possible, even though it means that sometimes you lose out on some of the stylistic or artistic behaviors and qualities that you wanted to put into the game. Again, for you it may seem painfully obvious, but you'll probably know how your UI works blindfoldedly, so you know what's there. It's not the first time that you have to read long blocks of text, and even then you probably want to avoid these long blocks of text. Always have very high contrast between your text and your background, something we also had to rework a lot during development. And make sure that your fonts aren't too small, but also don't make them too big. It's also a bit of a double-edged sword. One problem we had for the longest time with Forge Industry is that Thomas, who is notoriously bad in our team for UI, had a tendency to put every text element on auto-scaling up to font size 72. So you would end up with letters that would physically on your screen be like 5 centimeters tall, which was just like, this is too much. Like, we're not making a game for blind people. And then one last tip that I hadn't really ever thought about that much, but that I got as feedback from another developer is tween everything. What this means is give everything an animation. Opening windows, closing windows, just pressing buttons. Make nothing static. Don't just make it a immediate switch, but have an animation in it. Let it ease in, let it ease out. These things do a lot in how your game feels. A great example for this is how Hearthstone plays. I think Hearthstone has some of the best UI elements and UI interactions when you drag cards around and do things like that. So look into making it as animated as possible, but keep your animations still quite short. Just don't make them instant. And then our next big topic is game feel. This is a really hard one to explain because when you look at it surface level, it's just when the game feels good, when it has that juicy interactions, it's like, ooh, this is great. And once again here, there are a few things that you can do to make your game feel better. And honestly, I think you should start with how you control your game. Controls are really important to how does your game feel. And also, this is a bit similar to the intuitiveness that I talked about with the UI. When I play a game, I usually expect to be able to use WASD for navigation. And then maybe spells or movement or things like that are bound to like the buttons 1 to 3, or I can lean with Q and E. These are defaults almost. And there's a reason that they're default. I think a great way to find out what is bad controls is by playing old shooters from before the period of like Doom and Quake, where there wasn't this convention. So suddenly you had to play with really weird keyboard and mouse combinations, or you had to press shift to reload instead of sprinting, which is like the default now. And these things, they take a lot of effort to get right. Now, to help with this, I do always suggest that you, as a developer, make your keybinds rebindable. This is great just for accessibility reasons, but it also helps with, for example, if you have different keyboards. So you're like having, for example, we have Azerty here in Belgium, where we don't have WASD. We use like ZQSD or something. It's kind of weird. And this breaks games for some people even. Another thing that can help, again, similar to the UI, is animations and feedback. I don't mean animations here in terms of how you animate your UI, but how everything in your game is just that little bit moving. For example, you have grass particles that like slightly wave back and forth. You have trees that wave back and forth. Things that get impacted, they get like squeezed a bit. Or for example, when you get hit with a bullet, there's some screen shake or your screen flashes a little bit to give that instantaneous feedback of, oh, something is happening. Whatever I just interacted with has done something. Otherwise, this is something that you often feel when you're like early in prototyping. Your game has this weightless feeling almost because you interact with things, but nothing really happens. Like something happens on the UI, for example, or you shoot, but it doesn't feel like what you just did had an impact. Now be careful here because it's also very easy to go overboard with it. Something that we've been playing around with is there's this Unity asset called Feel, which is like all about game feel, and their defaults honestly are so over the top. It's like camera shaking gives you nausea, but they are, or when you just like shoot a gun, like your entire screen goes completely white for like 5 frames. That's too much, but it's a really good and really visual indication that you are doing something. You just need to tone these things down in your actual game. And then also a bit related to that weightlessness feeling is physics. Physics can actually greatly influence how does your game feel. For example, when you're jumping, you know, by default, if you play like an Unreal Engine game, it feels like you're floating, like you can jump for like 3 meters far and your jump lasts like 2-3 seconds almost, which if you've ever jumped in real life, and if you haven't, I suggest you stand up right now and jump for the first time, you'll notice that you can't jump that far. You jump quite fast, and this depends a bit on the genre you play as well, but generally you want to have some kind of physics, or you want to tweak the defaults. A lot of games you can often tell that they're made like in Unity or they're made in like Unreal because they have those default physics that haven't been tweaked. So it all feels a bit off almost. Spending a little bit of time in tweaking the physics of your game can also greatly influence your game's feeling. And then one last thing that also relates big bet to that feedback, like the screen shake and stuff, is sound. So things like, gun impacts and such. But I feel like sound is actually going to be my third main topic, because sound is so important, both music and sound effects, in conveying how your game feels to the player and how they will experience it. Almost everything the player does in the game should have a sound paired with it and should be somewhat relevant. For example, clicking through UI elements will usually have a sound. There's like plenty of clicking like sound effect packs there. But also things like walking around or dashing or jumping or shooting a gun all should have an accompanying sound, just to give that feedback of this is what's going on. But here the challenge lies in having correct sound, having sound that fits the action. You don't want to cast this epic spell and then suddenly it's just like a very short sound clip that doesn't really have that much impact. And on the other hand, you don't want to click through your UI menu and have it be very loud and maybe have like the Vine boom sound effect every time you like click on something menial. I think sound is also one of those things that generally you as a developer won't have that much experience with. So I do recommend to get some asset packs where you have like professionally recorded sounds and very much limit how many custom sound effects you make, because it's really hard to get good fitting sound effects. Only maybe there's like a few small things that are very unique to your game that you could make something for yourself. But sound effects are something that's quite easy to add. You just buy like some bundle with like 4,000 sound effects usually for like $20, and then you can get to work basically. You have everything you need almost, and worst case you just mesh some sound effects together in Audacity. That's what we did, and you have your sound effect for whatever thing you may need. Something else that's really easy to do in your engine but can elevate the way your game feels is spatial sound. I think some engines even do this by default almost, but if you play our game Forge Industry, every workstation you place down, there's like ambient sounds, or like when they're processing an item, they're like, for example, hammering on the forge. And depending on where your camera is positioned in respect to the building that's producing the sound, you'll hear it from a different direction in your headset, or it'll be louder or softer depending on the distance. This is very easy to do, but once again, it adds the depth to your game and makes it sound better instead of just always being able to hear everything. We used to have like a bug where like one building was like permanently hearable from everywhere, and it was maddening. It was not fun to hear at all. So get some spatial audio. And then also get some ambient sounds. Maybe you won't always be playing music, but you should still be playing something. We all have Zoomer TikTok brains at this point, and we need to have something to keep our ears stimulated. Even if it's just wind noises, for example, or the sounds of like a river flowing somewhere. You always need to have something. If you have a game that's truly dead silent, it just feels weird. It feels eerie, and usually it just doesn't really fit the vibe of whatever game you're making. And it doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be something that the player doesn't really notice. Only if they really stop and listen, they notice that there's sound effects that are like ambient. But by them being there, normally the player doesn't notice them, but it still feels much nicer to play. I think if you want to try this one out, you can download our demo of our game Forge Industry. And we actually have like separate sliders for our music and our ambient sound. And I suggest you turn down the music and you just listen to the ambient sound, and then also turn off the ambience and try to play our game that way. And you'll realize that there's a very big difference in how the game feels, even though there's very little difference in actually the sounds that are being made by the game. And then one last thing that I've noticed from playing some games that do this really well, but that I think is not applicable for everyone, is depending on your game, get dynamic sound. This usually means getting tools like Fmod or Wise, where you can, have dynamically scaling sound, where you add on layers if it's more epic, or you can do very nice transitions between scenes or when you enter like certain combat areas. This helps a lot, but this is already quite a bit of work. And usually you can't do this if you're not like dedicated as a sound artist, or you don't really have any experience with composing and things like that. This is something that you do need to leave a bit to the professionals. Our game, we just have static background music basically that plays, and we don't have any of those layers. For our next game, we do want to have those layers, but it is something that I've been looking into, and I've just come to the realization that I am not ready for this yet. But if you can get it working and you get it working nicely, your game is going to sound so great. And then one bonus thing, we already made a whole video about this, but honestly, I think another way you can greatly elevate your game is not by how you develop on it during development, but how you continue supporting it after development. Because you can playtest as much as you want. The moment your game releases, you're gonna get more feedback than you've ever gotten before. And by taking that feedback to heart and actually working with it, you'll hear about plenty of other small things, such as, for example, some game feel related things or UX or UI and related stuff that you can improve upon, and you should implement them. There's a limit to how much you should implement and how long, but for that I suggest you check out our whole dedicated video, but I figured I would just give you a little reminder that do some post-launch support as well. Anyway, I hope this video helped you guys a lot. I try to be as actionable as possible. Plenty of the things that I've said in this video, you can implement like now. Like for example, tweening is something really easy to implement in basically any engine and any game. So I do suggest that you go ahead and give that one a try. If you're new here, we're game developers. We've made our own game and we talk about how we make games and the things I've learned along the way of making our games. So if you're a game developer and it sounds like something that interests you, be sure to head down below and go ahead and subscribe, as it really helps us out. And you get this cool content twice a week, so it's a win-win for both of us. That's all I really had to say. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!